What a great privilege it is to stand here with all of these great women, with my wife, with Isabel, with Jen, with Linda, with Mindy. People who are leading the world in lots of different places and changing it. Changing it in extraordinary ways that are so elemental to our well-being. We need a world that is transformed. It's easy to be taken in awe by the built world around us. By built world, I don't just mean temples and churches and skyscrapers, but systems and structures like Jen was talking about. The ways that we construct our lives so that they feel safe and secure and eternal. And there's the trick, isn't it? Because we like to feel safe because our eternity is evidenced by the things that are always going to be around us. And it feels good. I know where I stand, I know who I am, because everything is going to be here tomorrow when I come back, and the next day, and the next day. But when we think for a moment, we know that's not true. We know because we've seen apartheid fall. We've seen the Iron Curtain fall. And that is good to leave in the back of our memory, but to remember. Leaving it in the back of our memory allows us space to address the horrors and the crises that are before us. Climate, Indigenous autonomy and sovereignty in this land. The changing role of women and of gender in the world, and the ways that things are changing could be overwhelming if we held all of those changes in the one space every day. We would not cope. But Jesus says, when they're looking at the temple and saying how amazing it is, Jesus says, don't look at what you think is permanent for your security. You might recognize that opening paragraph of the gospel from other contexts. One where they're speaking about the temple, and Jesus says, you can tear down this temple and I will raise it up in 3 days. And that, in fact, is quoted at Jesus' trial. Didn't really work to nail him up, but it was one of the things that was really shocking for people, because they too were looking for permanence in the systems and structures and buildings that were around them, instead of in the God who has given him God's self to them eternally. So in the place of that, they want to know what the schedule is. Teacher, when will this be? And what will be the sign that it's about to take place? And he says, none of your business. Get on with it. This is not for you to know. But beware. There are things going on and you'll think, this is the end. There'll be wars and rumours of wars, and nation against nation, and it seems like the end of the world. And let me tell you, when you're in the middle of that, when you're in the middle of floodwater, it feels like it's apocalyptic. When you're in the middle of a war, it feels apocalyptic. When you're in the middle of a great discussion in a great organisation that, like Synod or Parliament, it feels apocalyptic. When you're in the middle of a family breakdown or a death in your family, it feels apocalyptic. It feels like the end. When you're fighting for a cause that goes on and seems to never find resolution, it feels like this is going to be the end of me. So how do we find our place in the middle of all of this? I invite you to turn to the front page of the readings sheets. Was it Wednesday night? Tuesday night? We went up to the Paddington Reservoir up the hill, and we watched the moon in between clouds. It kept getting clouded over, But I got some great, very foggy photos on my phone where the moon was bright orange, and it was great, but, you know, it was really foggy, blurry. So our friend Anne, who you might have met, she has helped around the place from time to time. She was doing the craft at our community festival a couple of weeks ago. She works as a volunteer at the observatory, and she took this photo of the moon and Saturn. Can you see Saturn? If you squint and look really hard, I saw it a second ago and it moved. It's just, I thought I put it just above the S of Saturn, because that would be poetic, right? Anyway, it's just in there. I think it's above the T of Saturn. Saturn has a radius that's 9 times the size of Earth. The moon has a radius that's about a quarter the size of Earth. So that puts Saturn about 9 fours are 20, no, 36? 1836, right? Looking to the mathematician. I had it before. That's a lot bigger. Doesn't look very big in that picture. And yet, as we were looking at the moon and seeing the shadow of the Earth pass over it, it made me think, you know, how big has the sun got to be to make the shadow of the Earth so small that it only takes a little while for it to cross over the whole of the moon? I don't get it. I don't get that sort of magnitude. I don't conceive those magnitudes. We've talked often, as we acknowledge country, about the tenure, the length, the magnitude of Aboriginal sovereignty in this country, tens of thousands of years. Our Bible talks about ancient history of 2,500 years, 3,000 years. It's a drop in the bucket. It doesn't even hit the first tens of thousands of years. How do we get our heads around this magnitude? When I was a teenager, there was a television show called Monkey Magic. There's been a revival. The revival sucks. But in this, Monkey is a very mischievous and rebellious demigod, I guess, and decides to get out of, go beyond and see beyond the reach of God. And he goes through all of this amazing high-speed adventure, goes right across universes and finally gets to the clouds at the end of the universe. And he graffitis his name on one of the pillars at the end of the universe, and he says, "There, I've done it." And God closes his hand and says, "I'm here." Now that's a story from another faith background, but the truth is still there. That the God that we believe in is so far beyond our perception, so far beyond our ability to conceive, that we can trust. We know that as far as we go and as hard as it gets, God will be there. And we can graffiti on the pillars at the end of the universe, and it will still be in the palm of God's hand. When Isaiah talks about creating a new heavens and a new earth, I've always loved Isaiah because he paints the pictures of heaven in earthly terms so that we can get a hold of them, and they are very concrete. But this isn't a picture of heaven, because people will die. People will get to die at 100 years old and be considered youngsters. So this thing that Isaiah is talking about is before we die, is pre-heaven. This is about God working amongst us to build the kingdom amongst us now. This is what we are working for. This is what we go over every week, all of those justice things, all of those things about being the kingdom, about being good news, these are for part of God's purpose, of bringing that purpose into reality, in our midst now. And that work is tiring. It's exhausting. It can feel overwhelming, and it can feel never-ending, and it can feel futile, but we can sing to the Lord a new song. Yep, I think it's morning tea inside today. God has made known his victory. He has revealed his vindication in the sight of the nations. All will see. Doesn't matter what system you're working under, doesn't matter what objective you're working towards. Doesn't matter how inconceivable it seems, doesn't matter how far beyond other people's imagination it is, God's got your back. God is right there. But Paul warns that those who think that this is God's work, they're right. It is God's work. But if you think it's God's work so I can just sit back and relax, you got the wrong train. Because Paul says, get off your tail, get up and get to work. Those who think they can live in idleness and according to other traditions besides what they've received from us, you've got the wrong end of the stick. Because our work continues. And we can trust that God's got it and God's called us to it. And we can see from the testimony of Jen and Mindy that there is a lot to do. But we can also see that it is on God's agenda, that this is what God has called us to, that we are in the right place and we are doing what we've been called to do. And so our energy doesn't come from my ability to get enough carbs and proteins into my body, but rather from the passion that comes from a God who has called us from before the beginning of time and has in mind a kingdom that looks like that, where everyone eats from the fruit of their labour, that lives in the shelter of their own place, that where justice and equity is a characteristic of their life together. Amen.